You may remember that last Sunday we began walking through the 10 words or the 10 commandments in Deuteronomy 5, so we'll continue to do that today. Just sort of a reminder, remember that the idea here is that the 10 words, the 10 commandments, are part of God's effort to reintroduce order into creation. An order that's been upset and disturbed by sin. So we just want to remember here, right, that law here is a blessing from God that's designed to reintroduce order into the lives of people. And order's a good thing. It's generally better than chaos. So the other thing that I tried to emphasize last time is that the order here has a very definite shape to it. So order consists of two things. Order means that people are properly related to God, so that's the vertical relationship. And then it also means that people are properly related to one another, and that's the horizontal relationship. So the commandments are divided between addressing those two sets of relationships. And you'll remember that last time we looked at the first three commandments, which actually deal with the vertical relationship. And just to briefly summarize, right, the idea here is that first, God is to be the sole object of Israel's love, devotion, service. God is to be the ultimate object of loyalty, and there are to be no competing objects. So that's the first thing. Second thing, Israel is not to sort of try to make images of God that sort of please her or follow along from her current pattern of thinking. Images either physical or mental. Okay, so that's really important too. So there's a recognition here, right, that under sin, one of the things we continually do is we kind of like shrink God down so that God sort of fits into our frame of reference. And of course, that's any attempt to shrink God down is wrong. We have to simply recognize that God's beyond our frame of reference. And so we have to let God be God in that way. And then the third commandment, right, of not taking the Lord's name in vain means that Israel is always and everywhere to both act and speak in a way that does honor and glory to the fact that she's God's covenant people. Okay, so that's the Torah or the law regarding that horizontal relationship. So now we can take a look that's the vertical relationship. Now we can take a look at the horizontal relationship in terms of people being related to one another. So let's do that. So that gets us to, we also have the fourth commandment about the Sabbath and setting aside that day as a day of rest in anticipation of the rest that was going to come for all of creation at some point. And that gets us there, therefore, to the fifth commandment. So it's Deuteronomy 5:16. Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be long in the land, and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, notice here, there's this interesting connection between observing this commandment and living in the land. And I think that's not like coincidental. So we're being told here that this commandment has to do in a very essential and important way with what Israelite society is supposed to look like. And one of the features of what that's supposed to look like is that there must be a bond of respect and affection between the generations. So most Old Testament scholars think that this commandment actually is not being addressed primarily to small children obeying their adult parents, but rather adult children caring for their aged parents when said aged parents are no longer able to support themselves, right? And you can kind of see why this would be important, right? So we've got an agricultural society where there's no pension system, no Social Security. In effect, your children are your pension. Mom and dad have reached a point where they just can't work anymore. And so that raises a question, right? What should we think Or how should we treat people who are no longer contributing members of society? They are no longer useful. And the commandment here is, you're to treat them as your parents. You are to support them, because being useful is not the ultimate measure of being a human being. Now, I think this is a really important thing, right? That is, this commandment has had an enormous impact on Western society. The impact of that is wearing off, as we're seeing now some societies move to involuntary euthanasia for elderly people, right? They're taking up space in the hospital, they're expensive, let's get rid of them. But the idea here is that one of the things that marks a healthy society, a society in which people are properly oriented toward one another, is a sense of the bond between generations, okay? That it's not just, those people are old, they're no longer useful, let's park them somewhere or get rid of them altogether. No, the idea here is that there's a set of intergenerational obligations, right? Parents raise children. Children take care of parents when they're no longer able to support themselves. That's what this commandment is dealing with, and that's part of the mark of a healthy society in which people are properly oriented toward one another. Obviously, this is sort of like another issue that I think really affects us, especially in a society like we live in, right, that very much sort of values, youth and all this kind of stuff, where we're constantly trying to work to make ourselves young, and, we're going to the plastic surgeon, and we're getting rid of the wrinkles and the bags under our eyes, and we're getting hair transplants and all manner of other things, right? This is a way of saying that, growing old is a natural part of what it means to be a human creature, right? It's not like it's a defect, okay? If you grow old, right, it's not like you've done something wrong, okay? You haven't had the right diet, or, you haven't gone to the right doctor or something like that. But rather, being creatures, right, our lives as we currently experience them are finite. And so growing old is simply a natural part of human living, and that needs to be taken into consideration. So I think that's really important. The sixth commandment, you shall not murder, also is significant as well. So we want to talk about what that commandment means. So it's really important here why the Old Testament sees murder as so awful. It goes back to its assumptions about life. So in the Old Testament, right, New Testament too, all life is understood to be a gift of God. So this shows up in some really interesting ways. One way we've already seen that might be helpful to kind of bring at this point. You may remember that when we were going through the book of Leviticus, remember one of the things that Israel wasn't supposed to do was they were not supposed to eat blood of animals, right? So when you're going to kill an animal for food, or when you're going to kill an animal for sacrifice, right, you slit its throat and you drain all the blood out, and then you can eat it or offer it, right? And the idea there is that the blood represents the life of the animal. And notice the principle at the stake here, right? You, people of Israel, are free to kill animals and eat them for food, but don't get it into your mind that they simply belong to you, because all life is a gift from me. There's a really important distinction, right? That human beings are sort of allowed to do certain things, but we're never ever to think that we actually have authority over the gift of life itself. So murder here, which is the deliberate taking of someone's life, right? Murder here is considered to be not just bad, but murder here is understood to be part of the human rebellion against God. Because when you deliberately set out to take someone's life, right, you are saying, yes, I have authority over Fred's life, and I've decided that it's time that, Fred's in the way, and I'm going to get him out of the way. Okay, so murder here is sort of put off limits because it's another way that human beings try to sort of work themselves up and to sort of play God. In traditional moral theology, right, murder was considered what's called a mortal sin. In the sense, right, that if you committed it, right, that showed that you'd like completely separated yourself from God. If you're to the point where you think that you're the mastery over other people's lives, well, then your relationship with God obviously is like gone. If you get to that point, okay. So that's one of the things that's going on here is that simply sort of like killing people because they happen to be inconvenient or simply you want to get revenge on them or something like that, right? Murder here is so serious, and therefore that needs to be limited, and therefore, right, we have to remember that we are not the masters over life. I recommend that you read the commentary on the Sixth Commandment in the ACNA Catechism, which is very good because it sort of helps us see, right, that murder actually applies to everything all the way from euthanasia to suicide to abortion. Because in all those things, right, whether you're taking your own life, whether you're killing somebody else or whatever, right, you're in effect saying, yes, I'm the master of life, and I've decided that this life over here, or this life right here, it's time for it to end. And the idea here is that as human beings, as creatures, none of us has that authority. Only God. Only God has the authority to decide when life is over and when it should end. Now, I want to say a few things here about the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. This actually is a good kind of a takeoff on Father Bill's sermon here. Hopefully a little bit more brief since we have a couple commandments to go, but just want to make a couple points here that I think are really important. First, I think it's really important to get at the presupposition of the seventh commandment. That is, why is adultery here thought to be wrong, and not just wrong, but contrary to God's purposes? Well, I think it's this. In the mind of the Old Testament, and also in the mind of the New, and in the mind of Christian theology up until probably 20 years ago, the idea was that the sexual relationship between husband and wife was a sign of the marriage covenant. Okay, this is a really important point, right? So the idea here is that the sexual relationship between husband and wife, right, is itself a sign of the emotional and spiritual bond that exists between them. Such that in marriage, right, we have a physical bond, sex, we have an emotional bond, and we have a spiritual bond. Those bonds, in this way of thinking, right, are not detachable from the relationship. And so here's the point, I think that's really essential. Many churches have lost sight of this because of the sexual revolution and other things. The attempt to decouple marriage and sex, in effect, destroys the creation that God intended. God intended marriage and sex to go together as two parts of a whole, as two sides of the same coin. The attempt to pull them apart and in effect turn sex into kind of like a recreational activity or something like that, right? That like totally goes against all God's purposes here. And so I think it's important that we recognize that, and that's why adultery here is considered such a serious thing, right? Once again, right, just as murder is a way of saying, you know what, I'm the mastery of other people's lives, and if I don't think that Joe should be living any longer, I'm going to kill him. Adultery, in effect, says, you know what, I don't really care what God's purpose for sex are. I have my own set of purposes, and those are the ones that matter. So once again, it's like a form of like rebellion against God. Now, people will, of course, often say, well, gosh, you know, people have sexual desires and that kind of thing, and what are they supposed to do about them? And I think there's you know, one really helpful answer to that question. All of you probably know it already, but I'll just repeat it, right? Are we inherently sexual creatures? Yes. Do we have sexual desires? Yes. What should we do about them? It's called self-discipline. Okay? It's called self-discipline, or in the older theological term for this, and as you may have known, right, I really like old theology. It's the best. The older term for this, of course, was called the virtue of chastity. Right? It's a way of saying here, right, that one of the problems with the kind of culture we're living in is that the culture that we live in now has lost any sane perspective on sexuality at all. And you can kind of see it all around us, right? The effects are sort of like everywhere. Whether we're dealing with marriage breakup, whether we're dealing with pornography addiction, whether we're dealing with all manner of things, abuse, violence, we can see it all around us. The idea here, right, is that sex and the marriage covenant are essentially go together, and that sex here has some very important purposes. One is procreation, where God has given us the dignity and privilege of being involved in Him with the bringing about of new life into the world, so that's an important vocation. And also, sex serves as strengthening the bond between husband and wife. That goes back to what I was saying about the emotional relationship, spiritual relationship, physical relationship. All that belongs together. So adultery here is basically the sinful human decision to say, you know what, I don't really care what purposes God has proposed for my sexuality. I've got my purposes, and those are the ones that matter. Many years ago, when the sexual revolution began to kind of explode in the church, a lot of people said, well, we really shouldn't be spending a lot of time talking about sex because it's just not that important. Well, it is important because, right, it's one of the ways that God has called His people to be faithful to Him. Okay, and chances are, right, if we're not going to be faithful in that way, we're not going to be faithful in others, right? If we can rationalize being unfaithful in this dimension of life, we probably can rationalize being unfaithful in other dimensions as well, right? And that's sort of like another problem. The next commandment, commandment number 8, is you shall not steal. So just a quick word about that. The idea here, right, is, and this is I think, an important concept for the Old Testament, the theft is understood not so much as an offense against property. So, one night, I've got a farm, you've got a farm right next to mine. One night I decide that, I'm going to steal 3 of your cows, and in the dark of night I steal into your field and, appropriate 3 of your cows, and now they're tucked away in my barn somewhere. The idea here is that in doing that, I haven't merely stolen your property. I've actually harmed you. So the idea here is that property, animals, land, houses, things like that, property is an extension of a person. And in harming someone's property, you're harming them. Okay? And I think, interestingly enough, once again in the ACNA Catechism, theft here, the prohibition against theft, is actually applied to destroying somebody's reputation. Because what are you doing if you set out to destroy someone's reputation, right? You're harming them, right? You put something out on social media, well, so-and-so probably thinks this, and then other people pile on, right? So you're stealing that person's reputation, and that violates this commandment. So once again, right? This is another mark of a properly ordered society, where we honor one another enough so that we're not harming one another by destroying someone's reputation, by using all kinds of awful language about them, by appropriating things that belong to them, right? There's an element of respect and forbearance in a society that prevents all that from happening. The 9th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. This, too, is like a really, really important command. It's not just about lying. But we want to remember here, once again, back in Leviticus, remember the statutes that deal with courts. So remember that in Israel, the court system was based on the testimony of two adult men establishes something is true. You can't have just simply one witness because the witness might not be telling the truth, right? You have to have two, or at least two. So guess what would happen if the virtue of truth-telling began to fade and people understood themselves free to lie in a court? Well, of course, what would happen is the judicial system would simply collapse. And there literally would be no justice. And that's why this commandment is so important. Okay? It's important that people not lie, and certainly not lie in court. Because once again, the stability of the society depends on it. Right? Another way to put this, right, is guess what happens in a society where levels of trust are ever shrinking? It means that people believe every stupid thing that appears on social media or on cable news, regardless of whether it's true or not. Right? There's a huge consequence to the destruction of trust in a society that binds people together. Right? And so the idea here is that it's important that we honor the virtue of truth-telling. There's a wonderful story in 1 Kings. It's the story of Naboth's vineyard. You may remember it, right? Where King Ahab looks out of his window and he starts to covet a vineyard owned by a guy by the name of Naboth. And he realizes, right, that in Israel, right, you don't just take people's land. Now, unfortunately, right, he's married to Jezebel, who's a Philistine princess, and Jezebel says, hey, where I come from, if the king wants something, he just takes it. Why don't you do that? And Ahab is, not the best guy in the world, but at least, right, he has enough sense that we know in Israel we just don't do stuff like that. And so remember what Jezebel does? She bribes several witnesses to appear in court and say, I swear in a stack of Bibles, I heard Naboth denouncing God. And so guess what happens to Naboth? He's stoned for committing blasphemy. And now, right, nobody owns Naboth's vineyard, so guess who gets it? King Ahab. So that story is sort of like a dramatic representation, right, of what can happen when people don't honor the truth and start bearing false witness, right? The whole society can come unglued. Finally, the 10th commandment, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this because it's important. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor. So this is a prohibition against coveting. So I want to say a little bit about what coveting is, and then we'll move on. Now, you may have noticed that in today's reading from Ephesians, Paul makes a remark about coveting. Remember, he says that coveting is what? Idolatry. That is, there seems to have been a kind of a Jewish interpretation of what happens in Genesis 3, which in effect identifies the root of sin as coveting. And you can kind of think about why this is the case, right? So remember, the man and the woman are in the garden. They've got one another. They've got this beautiful garden around them they till and keep, so they've got meaningful work. They've got one another. They basically have everything except one thing, and that's that tree in the middle of the garden with the fence around it. The sign that says, visitors to the garden are kindly requested not to eat fruit from this tree. Something like that. That's the way that's the way it was put. So remember what the serpent does. The serpent draws their attention away from everything that they have to the one thing that they don't have. And says, you know what? It's awful, really, really awful, that you can't have the fruit from that tree. I mean, what's going on here? Why doesn't God want you to have what's growing on that tree? Well, if you'd like to know, if you'd like to know the real reason as opposed to the reason he gave you, it's this. God knows that once you eat from that fruit, you'll be exactly like him. And then he won't have anyone to boss around anymore. So go ahead and eat the fruit, right? And we're told, right, that they look at it and they desire it. That is, so there's a tradition that says, that the original sin actually was covetousness. The desire for something, right? And it's not just a desire for something, right? But it's two things going on. Thing number one, covetousness proceeds from a lack of thankfulness for what you have. And in that sense, right, we live in a society actually that cultivates covetousness, right? I occasionally, when I'm trying to do stuff on the treadmill to keep myself from growing older, it hasn't worked. No, just to let you know that. But anyway, seeing sort of like snippets from Home and Garden TV, right? And in many ways, right, I mean, I'm sure there's nothing nefarious about HGTV that's not all that bad, but there is sort of an element to cultivate covetousness, right? And it works something like this. What? It's been 2 years since you redid your kitchen? What's wrong with you? Look at this kitchen here. I mean, the cabinets are better than what you have. The countertops are better than what you have. And look at the plumbing fixtures. Oh my gosh. You've got antiques. Something like that. That's an example, right? That is covetousness, right, works, first of all, by getting us to be ungrateful for what we have, right? You live in a dump, so you need to spend a bunch of money to improve it. And then also, too, the other thing that's going on here, right, is the other thing that's going on in covetousness is we're constantly looking away from what we have to what we don't. And the problem, right, is that, that covetousness is a syndrome that gets us into that point, right, where nothing ever satisfies us, right? So it's always that question, right? Well, how much is enough? You renovate this, and this always happens, right? You paint the living room a new color, and the furniture looks bad. And so you get new furniture, and the carpet looks bad, and so you get new carpet. And then, the ceiling looks bad, and so you get the new ceiling done, and then the light fixtures look bad, and you get new light fixtures, and it just goes on and on and on and on. So, thing number one, lack of gratitude for what you have. Thing number two, always kind of looking around for the next thing to make you happy. That's what's going on here with covetousness. And notice why covetousness is such a horrible thing, why it's a kind of a form of idolatry. Under covetousness, right, once covetous sort of sinks into our hearts, right, we're actually going to get to the point where we will be unable to be thankful to God for pretty much anything. And once you reach that point, right, to kind of reference the quote that Father Bill made from the Screwtape Letters, right, once you reach that point where we're unable to really be thankful to God for anything at all, well, we're right where Uncle Screwtape wants us, okay, which is in pretty bad shape. Now, one final thing before we stop. This is looking at the end of Deuteronomy 5. Moses says this to the people of Israel. This is Deuteronomy 5:22 and following. These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain in the midst of the fire and the cloud and the thick darkness, and a loud voice he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, Behold, the Lord our God has shown his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of fire as we have, and has still lived? Go near and hear all that the Lord our God will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it. So notice what's going on here. Once again, we just want to remember that this experience on Mount Sinai is literally like overwhelming. Okay, there's thunder, there's the dark cloud that enshrouds the mountain, there's the lightning, there's the kind of the semi-earthquake shake that's going on. There's the voice of God speaking to Moses, and the people say, Moses, we have a favor to ask of you. You're our favorite person in the whole world. We really like you. What we would like you to do for us is, why don't you go up on the top of the mountain and meet with God, and we'll just stay down here, okay? And when God finishes telling you everything he wants to tell you, right? When you've spoken to God and met God face to face, then you can come down here and share with us what he said. That is, I think this is really important, right? The people of Israel are afraid, rightly so, of drawing near to the presence of God because they're afraid they're all going to die. They're afraid, in effect, right, that coming into the presence of the holy God, right, there's a sense in which they're just basically going to be like vaporized. And like they're all gone. Of course, that doesn't happen, right? But I think it's important, right, that they're beginning to sort of get this sense, right, of God's complete and total otherness, right? We are not dealing here simply with like a king raised to the 10th power. We're not dealing here with someone who's really, 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 really powerful. We're not dealing here with somebody who's like really, really, really holy. We're dealing with something here that's completely, totally, and absolutely beyond our ability to comprehend or beyond our ability to control. And we are scared stiff. So, Moses, what about it? Okay? So, I mean, I think that there's an important thing that's being acknowledged here about how the people of Israel see God. One more thing, and then we'll stop. Moses has one more important thing to say to the people of Israel. And it's this. This is Deuteronomy 5:28. And the Lord heard your words when you spoke to me. And the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and to keep my commandments. So here's the thing, this will be important for when we look at Deuteronomy 6 next Sunday. God here says, I wish that they always had a heart like this. A heart, right, that approached me with a sense of complete awe, complete reverence, of sort of a complete sense of my otherness, right? I wish that that's the kind of people they were, because that's the kind of people that I'm trying to create. I know, however, right, that that's not always where their heart's going to be. But that's what we're after, right? So we're not just, this is why I want to draw this point, right? God's not just simply after people who are willing to do certain things or like not do certain things. He's trying to form a people who are properly related to him and whose sort of like hearts and minds are set upon him. And if that happens, right, things will be really great, as of course we come to find out, right, there's only one person who's actually lived into that vocation, and he doesn't appear until the New Testament.